You're getting older, Eleanor. This house is too big for one person, too many stairs, too much maintenance, too much isolation by the lake. Maybe it's time you thought about a place of your own. Somewhere more suitable, more manageable. His words landed like ice water, deliberate, practiced. Morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting familiar shadows across the breakfast table where I'd shared thousands of meals with my family. Claire sat across from me, fingers wrapped around her coffee mug like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Jason occupied the head of the table. When the hell had that become his spot, buttering his toast with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. I kept my voice level, though something cold was spreading through my chest. What exactly are you getting at, Jason? He set down his knife with deliberate care. The folder appeared from beside his chair like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. I've taken the liberty of looking into some options for you. He slid it across the table. My name was written on the tab in Claire's handwriting, my own daughter's handwriting. There are some wonderful assisted living communities within an hour's drive. You'd have your independence, but with the security of knowing help's available when you need it. I stared at the folder. Inside were glossy brochures and Jason's neat handwritten notes comparing costs and amenities. This wasn't a conversation, it was a sales pitch. How long had they been planning this? How many evenings spent discussing my future, like I was some problem to solve? Mom? Claire's voice barely rose above a whisper. She couldn't meet my eyes. That single word Mom delivered in that forced, gentle tone told me everything. She was in on it. My Claire, who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd sobbed in my arms after her first heartbreak she'd been plotting my eviction. The timing couldn't be better, Jason continued, savoring my stunned silence. The market's strong right now. Your equity here would more than cover the entrance fees and monthly costs. You might even have money left over for travel, hobbies, whatever makes you happy. Travel, hobbies, like I was some retiree looking to downsize instead of a woman being pushed out of her own home. These places are really nice, Eleanor. Social activities, meal service, housekeeping included. No more worrying about snow removal or yard work or repairs. His smile was warm, concerned, perfectly calculated to hide what lay beneath. You deserve to enjoy these years without all the hassle. I opened the folder with steady hands, though my heart was hammering. The first brochure showed smiling seniors playing cards in a sterile common room. Sunrise Manor, where every day brings new possibilities. A month, I said quietly. Excuse me? Jason leaned forward, expression professionally attentive. You want me to give up my home, my independence, my entire life as I've known it for 30 years, and you're giving me a month to decide. That seems rather rushed. Claire finally looked up, eyes bright with unshed tears. Mom, we just want what's best for. For who? The words came out sharper than I'd meant. For me? Or for you and Jason? Uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Outside, a loon called across the lake, its cry echoing like a warning. I could feel them both watching me, waiting for my response to their carefully orchestrated intervention. But I wasn't ready to give them one. Not yet. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor, installed by my husband's own hands before Jason was even in the picture. The folder remained on the table between us, physical proof of their betrayal. I need some air, I said, walking toward the sliding door to the porch. Eleanor, we can talk about this more, Jason called after me, but I was already outside, morning breeze off the lake washing over me. The porch creaked under my feet, familiar as my own heartbeat. I gripped the railing and stared out at the water, its surface mirror smooth in the early light. This lake had been my sanctuary for decades. I'd watched Claire learn to swim in its shallows, scattered my husband's ashes from the dock on a morning just like this one. And now they wanted me to trade it all for a room in a facility where strangers would monitor my pills and organize my social calendar. Behind me, I could hear low voices from the kitchen. Jason's confident baritone, Claire's uncertain responses, planning my future, no doubt, discussing timelines, how to handle my resistance. They thought they knew me, thought I was some fragile old woman who'd accept their decision with gratitude, maybe even relief. They thought my silence meant I was giving in. They were dead wrong. The lake stretched out before me, vast and patient and enduring. I wasn't going anywhere. And if Jason thought he could charm and manipulate me out of my own home, he was about to find out just how wrong he could be. The loon called again, and this time it sounded less like a warning and more like a battle cry. The morning light filtered through the lakeside dining room windows, catching the dust motes that danced above our breakfast table. Jason sat across from me, his fingers wrapped around his coffee mug, with that practiced ease he'd perfected the concerned son-in-law, the caring family man. Claire sat between us, her gaze fixed on her untouched toast, and I should have known then that something had already been decided without me. "Eleanor," Jason began, and the way he used my name instead of his usual mom sent a cold thread through my chest. "We had an interesting conversation with our financial advisor yesterday." I set down my own mug, noting how the coffee suddenly tasted bitter. "Oh?" "He mentioned something about stress." Jason's voice carried that smooth authority he wielded like a scalpel. "How it affects investment portfolios, family dynamics." He said, and these are his words, not mine, that sometimes the source of household stress needs to be addressed. The soil from yesterday's gardening still clung beneath my fingernails, and I found myself scraping at it absently. 3 decades in the emergency room, watching families fracture over medical bills and diagnoses, and now I was being diagnosed myself, not by a doctor, but by a financial advisor I'd never met. "Stress," I repeated, the word sitting heavy on my tongue. Claire shifted in her chair, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried that rehearsed quality I recognized from when she was 12, reciting lines for the school play. "Mom, you know how your morning calls can be. Loud. And the gardening, the constant coming and going. The gardening." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw Jason's words emerging from her mouth like a ventriloquist's trick. "My gardening causes stress?" "She's not wrong, Mom." Claire's eyes flickered to Jason, seeking approval, finding it in his slight nod. The betrayal cut deeper than any scalpel ever could, not because she agreed with him, but because she needed his permission to wound me. Jason leaned forward, his cologne that expensive bergamot scent that had replaced the simple soap smell of our home filling the space between us. "We're just thinking about what's best for everyone." The financial advisor suggested that perhaps alternative living arrangements might reduce the household stress levels. For investment purposes, you understand. Alternative living arrangements. The phrase hung in the air like a diagnosis no one wanted to name. I thought of the property deed locked in my desk drawer upstairs, the lakeside porch where I'd taught Claire to read, where her childhood drawings still lived in a box marked "Precious Things." Now I was being evicted from my own memories, all in the name of portfolio management. "There are some lovely communities," Jason continued, his tone maintaining that veneer of concern even as his eyes calculated square footage and market value. "Places where you could relax, not worry about maintenance, have people your own age to talk to." People my own age. As if 68 meant I needed to be corralled with others approaching their expiration dates. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor, a harsh sound that made Claire flinch. "I need to wash up," I said, moving to the kitchen sink. The lakeside porch's wood stain from yesterday's project clung to my palms, and I scrubbed at it with dish soap, watching the brown water swirl down the drain. But the residue remained, worked into the creases of my hands like the truth working its way into my bones. Some stains don't wash clean. Behind me, I heard Jason murmur something to Claire, his voice low and intimate, the voice of conspiracy. When I turned back, drying my hands on the dish towel my mother had embroidered 50 years ago, I saw them sitting closer together, a united front against the family stress factor. "Mom," Claire started again, and this time I heard it clearly, the script Jason had written for her, each word carefully chosen to seem caring while systematically dismantling my place in my own home. "We just want what's best. For the portfolio," I finished. "Yes," I heard. Jason's charming facade cracked for just a moment, a flash of irritation that reminded me of a snake's tongue testing the air. But he recovered quickly, always did. For the family, Eleanor. For all of us. I looked around the dining room, at the walls that held decades of Christmas dinners and birthday celebrations, at the window overlooking the lake where I'd watched Claire take her first swimming lessons. Every corner whispered of the life I'd built, and now it was being reframed as a source of stress, a line item to be optimized. I'll think about it, I said, knowing that thinking about it meant recognizing what was really happening here. My son-in-law was laying siege to my life, and my daughter, my Claire, was helping him hold the battering ram. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I heard Jason's voice drift up behind me, casual and confident. The financial advisor says these transitions work best when they happen quickly. Less stressful that way. Less stressful. I closed my bedroom door and went to my desk, pulling out the property deed, running my fingers over the raised seal. Outside my window, the lakeside porch gleamed in the morning sun, the fresh stain I'd applied yesterday already, drying to a rich, permanent finish. Some things, I thought, refuse to be washed away. Some things insist on leaving their mark. But as I heard Claire's nervous laughter from downstairs, that rehearsed sound that meant she was following Jason's lead again, I realized the deepest wounds weren't the ones that showed. They were the silences, the moments when those you birthed and raised chose someone else's script over their own mother's truth. The morning light shifted, casting long shadows across my bedroom floor, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I wasn't just fighting for my house anymore. I was fighting for the right to exist in my own life, to be more than a stress factor in someone else's financial equation. And Claire, my daughter, my heart had already chosen her side. The wood stain on my hands had finally faded, but the residue of betrayal would linger far longer, worked into the grain of everything that followed. The glossy brochure appeared on my dining table like an unwelcome guest, its cheerful photographs of smiling seniors and manicured gardens glowing under the evening light. Maple Grove Senior Living Community, the header proclaimed in elegant script, as if the very font could convince me this was a gift rather than a gentle push toward the door. "I thought you might find this interesting," Jason said, settling into his chair with that careful smile. He'd perfected the one that never quite reached his eyes. He gestured toward the brochure as though he were presenting me with vacation photos. "Claire and I picked it up today. Beautiful place, really. They have activities, meal service, even a library." Of course they did. Of course he'd done this during their afternoon together, probably discussing my future over coffee while I watered my garden, unaware that my independence was being packaged and priced per month. I touched the brochure's edge, the paper thick and expensive beneath my fingertips. Someone had invested considerable money in making displacement look appealing. "How thoughtful," I said, my voice level despite the tremor I felt in my chest. Claire shifted in her seat, her eyes finding everything in the room except my face. That hesitation, that choking silence that had become her signature, whenever Jason steered our conversations toward my supposed limitations, spoke louder than any words. Jason leaned forward, his cologne cutting through the familiar scents of my dining room like an invasion. "The amenities are really impressive, Eleanor. 24-hour care, social activities, transportation to shopping and medical appointments, no more worrying about maintenance or upkeep." His tone carried the practiced warmth of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation, each word polished to hide its sharp edges. "Worrying?" I set the brochure down carefully, centering it precisely between my coffee cup and the stack of unopened mail I'd been ignoring. "Did you forget whose name is on the deed to this house?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Jason's smile flickered, just for a moment, before reassembling itself. But he said nothing. The silence stretched between us, awkward and telling, as he seemed to search for the right response, or perhaps the right way to deflect. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Of course not. But think about it practically, all this space, the stairs, the maintenance. Wouldn't it be nice to have someone else handle those concerns?" Practically. As if my life here by the lake, the morning coffee on the porch that had been my ritual for 20 years, the garden I'd cultivated from bare earth, the rooms where Claire had grown up, as if all of it could be reduced to square footage and practical concerns. I felt Miriam's eyes on me from across the table, her presence the only anchor of silent support in this carefully orchestrated ambush. Someone else, I repeated softly. How convenient that would be. For you, I didn't add, though the words pressed against my lips like caged birds. Claire finally spoke, her voice small and strained. Mom, we're not saying you have to do anything. We just thought. We? I turned to face my daughter fully, seeing in her expression the same uncomfortable mixture of guilt and determination I'd witnessed when she was 16 and trying to justify staying out past curfew. Except this time, the stakes weren't about broken rules or teenage rebellion. This time, they were discussing erasing me from my own life as casually as rearranging furniture. Claire's right, Jason interjected smoothly, placing his hand over my daughter's with the practiced gesture of a man claiming territory. No pressure at all, just something to consider for the future. Quality of life, you know. Peace of mind for everyone. Peace of mind for everyone. The phrase settled in my stomach like cold stone. I understood now what I was witnessing. Not concern, but strategy. Not love, but logistics. The supposed gift of care was, in fact, a disguised step toward erasing my authority, packaged in glossy photographs and cheerful promises of community activities. I stood, the movement sudden enough to make Claire flinch. Thank you for thinking of me, I said, each word carefully measured. But I believe I'll stay right here, in my house, on my land, where I belong. I picked up the brochure, its weight somehow both insignificant and enormous in my hands. I'm sure there are many people who would benefit from this kind of assistance. Without waiting for their response, I walked to the kitchen, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors that had witnessed decades of family dinners, birthday celebrations, and quiet evenings. Behind me, I heard the scrape of chairs and murmured conversation, Jason's voice too low to make out the words, but the tone unmistakably frustrated. In the kitchen, I deposited the brochure in the trash bin, watching as it disappeared beneath coffee grounds and eggshells. The simple act felt like a small victory, a reclamation of control in a moment that had threatened to slip away from me entirely. Yet even as I did it, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that the brochure was merely the opening move in a much larger game, one where the stakes were nothing less than my dignity, my independence, and my right to remain Eleanor Matthews in my own home. When I returned to the dining room, Jason was helping Claire with her coat, his movements sharp with barely contained irritation. We should head home, he said without looking at me. Early day tomorrow. Of course, I replied, matching his tone with cool politeness. Drive safely. After they left, the house settled into familiar silence, but it felt different now, charged with the residue of unspoken threats and carefully planned betrayals. I sat in my chair, still warm from dinner, and stared at the space where the brochure had been. The distrust that had been growing like a shadow in the corners of my mind now spread into full daylight, impossible to ignore. They would be back. Of this, I was certain. And next time, Jason's patience might not stretch quite so far, his mask might not hold quite so firmly. The thought should have frightened me, but instead, I felt something harder and more resilient, taking root in my chest, a quiet defiance that whispered of battles yet to come, and a dignity that would not be so easily packaged and relocated. The deed to this house bore my name, and by God, that meant something. It meant everything. The morning light filtering through my kitchen window felt different, somehow thinner, less welcoming. I stood at the sink, coffee mug warming my palms, watching the lake's surface ripple in the gentle breeze. This had been my ritual for 30 years, this quiet communion with the water and the dawn. But today, something was missing. My handmade curtains were gone. The cheerful yellow fabric I'd sewn myself, the delicate embroidered flowers that had caught the sunrise each morning, replaced overnight by stark white panels that hung like surrender flags in my own windows. I set down my mug with trembling fingers, the ceramic clicking against the granite countertop Jason had installed without asking. Much better, don't you think? Jason's voice materialized behind me, smooth as oil on water. More modern. More appropriate. Appropriate. The word sat heavy in my chest like a stone. I turned to face him, noting how his expensive cologne had already begun to claim the space where my morning coffee had once reigned supreme. He stood in the doorway wearing that practiced smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes, adjusting his silver watch, a gesture I'd begun to recognize as his tell when he was particularly pleased with himself. "They were my mother's pattern," I said quietly, my voice barely disturbing the air between us. "Were they?" He stepped closer, and I caught the calculation behind his concerned expression. "Claire mentioned you might be getting a bit sentimental about old things. Natural at your age, of course. At my age, 68 years of living reduced to a patronizing dismissal." I felt my spine straighten, that old teaching instinct kicking in the same steel that had once silenced rowdy classrooms now rising in my throat. But Claire appeared in the doorway then, her face pale and uncertain, and the words died unspoken. My daughter's eyes found mine for just a moment before darting away, and in that brief contact I saw something that made my heart contract: guilt. She knew. She had known about the curtains, had perhaps even chosen the replacements. The realization hit me like a physical blow. "Mom, she started, then stopped, her hands twisting at her sides in that nervous habit she'd had since childhood. "The new ones let in so much more light," Jason said, moving to stand beside his wife, his arms sliding around her waist with possessive ease. "Don't they, Claire?" "Yes," she whispered, and the single word landed in the silence like a betrayal. I walked past them both, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors that had once creaked familiarly under my step. Even they had been refinished, stripped of their comfortable imperfections. In the living room, more evidence of my disappearing life greeted me. The wall where my wedding photos had hung for decades now displayed a series of abstract prints in cold blues and grays. My husband's warm smile, caught in silver frames, had been packed away like embarrassing secrets. The cedar chest, my grandmother's cedar chest, where I kept Claire's baby clothes, my mother's letters, the tangible threads of our family history sat in the corner, a donate sticker affixed to its worn surface like a death sentence. My hands found the chest's familiar brass handles, worn smooth by generations of women's touch. I tried to lift it, but my strength failed me, and I found myself kneeling beside it instead, my palms flat against its scarred surface. This chest had survived the Depression, 3 moves, a house fire, and 40 years of Claire's childhood treasures. Now it bore a dollar store sticker, marking it for disposal. "The movers can take that to Goodwill this afternoon," Jason said from behind me, his tone casual, as if discussing the weather. "We need the space for the nursery furniture anyway." Nursery. The word should have brought joy, should have filled the hollow spaces in my chest with grandmother's anticipation. Instead, it felt like another erasure my history cleared away to make room for a future. I apparently had no part in shaping. Claire remained silent, her presence a shadow at the edge of my vision. I searched her face for some trace of the little girl who had once curled up in this very chest during hide-and-seek, who had insisted on keeping her drawings in its depths, like precious treasure. But this woman, my daughter, simply stood there while her husband dismantled my existence piece by piece. The morning dissolved into a series of small deaths. My garden books, collected over decades of nurturing this lakeside property, boxed for donation because digital resources are more practical. The antique lamp my students had gifted me upon retirement, replaced by harsh LED fixtures that made everything look clinical and cold. Even the light bulbs in the chandelier, the soft, warm ones I'd always preferred, swapped out for stark daylight bulbs that made my skin look gray and tired in the hallway mirror. I caught my reflection in that mirror and barely recognized myself. When had I become this translucent person, this ghost haunting her own home? My silver hair seemed dulled, my blue eyes uncertain. I looked like a woman disappearing, fading incrementally with each replaced item, each casual dismissal of my preferences, my history, my right to exist in my own space. But it was the folder on the side table that truly stopped me cold. A manila folder, thick with official-looking documents, labeled in Jason's precise handwriting, "Property transfer, Lake House." My blood stilled in my veins as I stared at those words, understanding blooming like a poisonous flower in my chest. This wasn't just about making room for a baby or modernizing an old woman's outdated tastes. This was something else entirely, something calculated and methodical and utterly devastating. My fingers itched to open that folder, to see what schemes were being hatched in my own home, but footsteps on the porch interrupted my contemplation. Through the window, I saw Mrs. Henderson from next door approaching, her expression troubled. "Eleanor?" she called through the screen door. "Might I have a word?" I welcomed the interruption, needing to step away from that folder before I did something I might regret. Mrs. Henderson had been my neighbor for 15 years, a reliable source of borrowed sugar and shared gossip about the changing seasons around the lake. "Of course, Martha," I said, stepping onto the porch that still felt like mine, still held traces of my presence in the weathered rocking chairs and the hanging plants I'd nurtured through countless summers. Martha glanced toward the house, ensuring we were alone, then leaned closer. "I don't like to interfere, dear, but I felt you should know. I saw Jason yesterday afternoon, down by the marina." Something in her tone made my pulse quicken. "Oh?" He wasn't alone. Martha's weathered hands fidgeted with her purse strap. There was a woman with him. Young thing, blonde. They seemed, well, quite friendly. The words hit me like a slap, sharp and unexpected. I gripped the porch railing, feeling the wood grain bite into my palms. A woman? They were looking at papers together, sitting awful close in his car. She had her hand on his arm, and they were laughing about something. Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. "Eleanor, I don't like to spread tales, but the way they were carrying on, it didn't look like business to me." My mind reeled, trying to process this new information alongside everything else. The systematic erasure of my presence, the property folder, Claire's pregnant silence, Jason's increasing boldness. The pieces were forming a picture I didn't want to see, a betrayal so profound it made the missing curtains seem trivial by comparison. Did Claire know he was out? I heard myself ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Martha shook her head slowly. "She was here with you, wasn't she? I saw her car in your drive all afternoon. So while my daughter sat in my living room watching her husband pack away my life, he was down at the marina with another woman, planning God knows what kind of future." The hypocrisy was breathtaking, the cruelty almost artistic in its precision. After Martha left, I stood alone on the porch, watching the lake water lap against the shore with its eternal patience. The water didn't judge, didn't scheme, didn't pretend to love while planning betrayal. It simply existed, constant and true qualities I was beginning to realize had become foreign in my own household. Inside, I could hear Jason and Claire talking in low voices, their words indistinct but their tone conspiratorial. They were discussing me. I realized discussing my future, my home, my life, as if I were a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected. The property folder still sat on the side table, its presence both threatening and tantalizing. But now it wasn't just about my home being stolen from me. It was about a deeper betrayal. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as I heard Jason's key turn in the front door, 3 hours late. Again. I remained still in my reading chair by the window, the lake reflecting moonlight like scattered diamonds, my book long forgotten in my lap. "Sorry I'm late," Jason's voice carried from the entryway, smooth as always. "Client meeting ran long. You know how these property deals can be." Claire's soft murmur of understanding drifted through the house. My daughter's voice held that particular tone, the one she'd used since childhood when she wanted to avoid conflict. It pierced something deep inside me now. I should have gone to bed, should have pretended sleep like any sensible woman my age. Instead, I found myself drawn toward the living room, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors I'd polished for 30 years. The house knew my footsteps. Not a single board creaked beneath my weight. Jason stood near my mahogany desk, the one that had been my father's, speaking in low tones into his phone. His expensive cologne hung heavy in the air, a sharp contrast to the familiar scent of lavender I kept in small sachets throughout the house. In his free hand, He held a slim folder marked with official-looking seals. "She's not suspicious yet," Jason said into the phone, his voice carrying that particular quality I'd noticed lately, charm layered over something harder, like honey poured over steel. "Eleanor trusts me completely. The paperwork should be processed by month's end." My heart hammered against my ribs. The folder disappeared quickly into his briefcase as Claire appeared in the doorway, her hair mussed from sleep. "Everything okay?" she asked, but her eyes avoided mine even though she couldn't see me in the shadows. There was something rehearsed about the question, something that made my chest tighten with a different kind of pain. "Just business, sweetheart," Jason replied, pulling Claire close with practiced affection. "Your mother's been so generous with the house arrangements. I want to make sure everything's handled properly." The way he said generous like I was some doddering old woman who needed management sent ice through my veins. But it was Claire's silence that cut deepest. Not a word of protest, not a single question about what arrangements he meant. Just that soft, complicit quiet that spoke louder than any accusation could have. I watched my daughter lean into her husband's embrace, and for a moment, she looked exactly as she had at 5 years old, hiding behind my skirt when caught drawing on the walls. Those drawings, the ones tucked away in my bedroom dresser, faded now but still precious. Had I failed her somehow, made her so afraid of confrontation that she'd choose silence over protecting what was right? "The deed transfer documents are almost ready," Jason continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Once Eleanor signs, we can move forward with the development plans. The lakefront alone is worth triple what she paid." Development plans. The words echoed in my mind like a death knell. This house, this land that held every memory of my life since retirement, every morning coffee watch sunrise paint the lake in watercolors, every afternoon spent reading on the porch that creaked in all the familiar places he was planning to destroy it all. Claire shifted in his arms, and I caught the briefest glimpse of her face. There was knowledge there, heavy and uncomfortable, but no surprise. She knew. Dear God, she knew, and she'd said nothing. The floorboard beneath my right foot, the one that always groaned near the kitchen doorway, finally betrayed me. Jason's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the darkness where I stood frozen like a deer in headlights. "Did you hear something?" Claire whispered. "Just the house settling," he replied, but his gaze lingered on the shadows. "Old houses make noise. Old houses." As if my home was some decrepit burden, rather than the sanctuary I'd built with my late husband's dreams and my own careful savings. The house where I'd planned to live out my days, watching grandchildren if Claire ever gave me any play on the same shores where she'd learned to skip stones. I retreated to my bedroom, each step measured and silent, my mind racing. The property deed sat in my safe, along with my will, my husband's life insurance papers, and the small collection of jewelry I'd planned to pass down to Claire. Had Jason already found ways around those protections? The folder he'd hidden so quickly, were those the forged contracts, the fraudulent documents that would strip away everything I'd worked for? Sleep was impossible. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of Jason and Claire moving through the house below. Their voices were too low to understand now, but the rhythm told a story I didn't want to believe. Comfortable conspirators, partners in betrayal. By morning, I knew things would return to normal on the surface. Jason would charm me over breakfast, compliment my coffee, maybe even bring me flowers as he'd been doing lately, small gestures that now felt like coins over a dead woman's eyes. Claire would kiss my cheek and ask about my plans for the day, her voice bright with false cheer. But I would remember this moment, the midnight betrayal, when I learned that silence could wound as deeply as any spoken lie. When I discovered that my own daughter's quiet complicity cut deeper than her husband's greed. The lake outside my window had turned black under the clouded moon, its surface now reflecting nothing but darkness. Just like my world, just like the trust I'd foolishly placed in family bonds that were apparently as fragile as morning frost. I would wait. I would watch. I would gather my strength and my proof. And when the time came, I would fight for every board, every nail, every memory that made this house my own. They wanted my silence, my blind trust, my dignified surrender. They would get known of those things. The silence of the house echoed, old boards whispering like witnesses to betrayal. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as I watched Claire move around Jason like she was afraid to disturb the air around him. "Mom, don't take it personally," she said, not meeting my eyes as she poured his coffee first, then mine an afterthought. "Jason just needs room to breathe." "And where does that leave me?" I asked, though the question hung in the space between us like smoke from a dying fire. Claire's shoulders tensed, but she didn't answer. She never answered anymore. The silence had become her weapon of choice, sharper than any accusation Jason might level at me. This silence felt like a weapon, heavier than any words. I remembered just 3 days ago, over breakfast, when Jason had casually suggested with that charming smile that fooled everyone but me, that maybe I should consider a nice assisted living place by the lake. The words had sliced through the morning peace like a blade through silk. Even then, Claire had said nothing, just stirred her coffee and looked away, as if her silence could somehow make his suggestion disappear. This silence felt like a weapon, heavier than any words. But silence doesn't erase betrayal. It fertilizes it. This silence felt like a weapon, heavier than any words. "He's under a lot of pressure at work," Claire continued, finally looking at me with those eyes that used to light up when she'd run to me with scraped knees and broken toys. Now they held something I couldn't name: guilt, maybe, or the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying someone else's lies. I watched Jason emerge from what used to be my study, now transformed into his makeshift office. He'd moved my reading chair to the basement last week, claiming it didn't fit the aesthetic. In its place sat a sleek black desk that looked like it belonged in a corporate boardroom, not a lakeside home where 3 generations of my family had found peace. "Morning, Eleanor," he said with that practiced warmth that made my skin crawl. His cologne, expensive and aggressive, had replaced the gentle scent of lavender and old books that once defined this space. "Jason," I replied, keeping my voice steady, even as I noticed him sliding something into a manila folder. The tab read property deed in his precise handwriting, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The discovery hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't ignorance on Claire's part, this was consent. Active, deliberate consent. "I'll be working late tonight," Jason announced, already establishing his dominion over the evening hours. "Claire and I thought it might be good for you to have some quiet time to yourself. Maybe turn in early?" Claire nodded along like a marionette, and something inside me cracked. Not broke, cracked. There's a difference. Broken things can't hold anything. Cracked things let everything leak out slowly, painfully. "Of course," I said, because what else could I say? That I saw through his manipulation? That I recognized the careful way he was erasing me from my own home? That my daughter's complicity cut deeper than any stranger's betrayal ever could? After Jason left for his meeting, probably another step in whatever scheme he was orchestrating, I found myself standing on the lakeside porch, the boards creaking under my feet like old bones settling. The sound used to comfort me. Now it felt like a warning. Claire appeared in the doorway behind me, hesitant. "Mom," she started, then stopped. "You what, Claire?" She looked out over the lake, avoiding my gaze. "I just think, highlighted fix, maybe Jason has a point. About you needing help. About this house being too much for you." The words landed like stones in still water, each one sending ripples through 40 years of motherhood. "Too much for me," I repeated slowly. "This house where I raised you, where you took your first steps, where you drew that picture of the sun over the lake that's still hanging in the hallway." For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, recognition, maybe even shame, but then it was gone, replaced by that careful blankness she'd perfected since marrying Jason. "Things change, Mom. People's needs change." "Yes," I said quietly, "they do." That night, as I lay in my bed, the one piece of furniture Jason hadn't yet found a reason to replace, I listened to the sounds of my house being slowly claimed by someone else. His voice carried from the kitchen, confident and possessive. Claire's responses came in murmurs, agreeable and soft. The folder marked property deed haunted my thoughts. Whatever Jason was planning, whatever legal maneuver he was orchestrating, Claire knew, had always known. Her silence wasn't protection or ignorance, it was collaboration. This silence felt like a weapon, heavier than any words. I thought about the breakfast conversation again, how Jason had mentioned nice assisted living while buttering his toast like he was discussing the weather. How Claire had sat there, stirring sugar into coffee that didn't need sweetening, saying nothing while her mother's future was being planned without her consent. The porch creaked again in the wind, and this time I heard it clearly, a sound like a door opening, or maybe closing. Tomorrow would bring another day of watching my home transform around me, another day of Claire's careful avoidance, another day of Jason's territorial expansion. But something had shifted tonight. The hollow ache in my chest was hardening into something else, something that felt suspiciously like resolve. It wasn't Jason's presence that was hollowing out this house. It was Claire's silence that echoed in every room, bouncing off walls that had once held laughter and now contained only the careful choreography of betrayal. This silence felt like a weapon, heavier than any words. The next dinner we shared as a family would be different. I could feel it in the way the old porch boards settled, in the way the lake lapped against the shore with unusual insistence. The truth had been buried under layers of politeness and manipulation, but like everything buried by water, it would eventually surface. And when it did, there would be no more silence, no more careful avoidance, no more letting my daughter watch while my life was dismantled piece by piece. This silence felt like a weapon, heavier than any words. The lake had taught me patience over the years, but it had also taught me about the power of erosion, how water, given enough time and persistence, could wear away even the strongest stone. Claire's silence had been eroding my heart for months, but two could play that game, and I had been learning patience far longer than she had been learning complicity. This silence felt like a weapon, heavier than any words. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch as I returned from my errands, arms full of groceries that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Laughter spilled from inside my house, my own house, yet it sounded foreign, like strangers had claimed the space. Through the window, I glimpsed pink and blue streamers, clusters of balloons and faces I didn't recognize. A baby shower. In my home, without a word to me. I stood on my own threshold, grocery bags cutting into my fingers, and drew a breath that tasted of lake water and something bitter erasure. The door opened before I could reach for it. Claire stood there, her smile faltering when she saw me, ultrasound prints clutched in her hand like shields. "Mom," she said, the word strained, almost choking on it. "You're back early." Early. As if I needed permission to return to the house I'd lived in for 37 years. Behind her, Jason's voice rose above the chatter, that polished charm he wore like expensive cologne. "The nursery will go in the East Room, better light for the baby." The East Room. My late husband Robert's study, where his books still lined the shelves, where I still kept his reading glasses on the desk exactly as he'd left them. "Mom, can we please not make a scene?" Claire's voice dropped to a whisper, her eyes darting back to the guests. I stepped inside, setting the groceries down with deliberate calm. The walls told the story before anyone spoke it aloud. Our family photographs, decades of memories, had vanished. In their place hung ultrasound images, blown up and framed as if they were masterpieces. The portrait of Robert that had watched over our living room for 15 years was gone, replaced by a massive print of the baby's profile in utero. A woman I'd never met touched my arm. "You must be so excited to be a grandmother." Her smile was bright, expectant, waiting for me to perform joy. "Thrilled," I said, the word precise as a scalpel. My eyes found the corner where Claire's childhood drawings once held pride of place. Now a pile of gift bags obscured them entirely. "No, wait." I moved closer, pretending to admire the presents. The drawings weren't just hidden, the box containing them had been shoved into the hall closet, visible through the crack in the door, covered in dust. Those crayon hearts and stick figure families that once meant everything to her, now discarded like old newspapers. "Dignity is not a gift they can take," I reminded myself, feeling my spine straighten. "It's a line I will defend." Jason appeared at Claire's shoulder, his hand possessive on her back. Eleanor, we wanted to surprise you. His smile never reached his eyes. Isn't it wonderful? All these people here to celebrate our growing family. Our family, not the family. The distinction cut deep, surgical in its precision. We were just discussing the changes we'll need to make, he continued, gesturing broadly, modernizing the space for the baby. He'll take care of everything once the baby's here. This last part directed at a man in a suit standing near the kitchen, who nodded with the satisfied air of someone counting future profits. I excused myself, phone already in my hand, moving through my transformed home like a ghost at my own wake. In the hallway, I stopped. There, barely visible beneath a stack of baby catalogs, were papers that made my blood chill, copies of property deeds, my property deed. My fingers trembled as I lifted them just enough to photograph the visible portions. References to transfer agreements and power of attorney peppered the margins in Jason's handwriting. Through the doorway, I caught Miriam's eye. My oldest friend stood at the edge of the party, her expression tight with concern. She'd noticed, too, the systematic removal of my presence, the colonization of my space. She gave me the slightest nod, a promise of support I desperately needed. I slipped into Robert's study, the future nursery, and found more evidence. Contracts with renovation companies, all bearing Jason's signature as acting owner. My name appeared nowhere except as current resident, to be relocated. The rage that rose in me was cold, clarifying. I photographed everything, emailed the images to myself, to Miriam, to my cloud storage. Evidence, ammunition. Returning to the party, I activated my phone's voice recorder, slipping it into my pocket. Jason was holding court near the fireplace, describing his vision for the estate my home reduced to a real estate term. It's just paperwork, Claire was saying to someone, her voice carrying that rehearsed quality I recognized from when she was 7 and lying about broken vases. He said it's standard, for tax purposes. The suited man pulled Jason aside, and I watched them exchange an envelope. Quick, practiced, but not quick enough. My phone captured it all, the furtive glance, the satisfied nod, the money changing hands, or was it contracts? Either way, conspiracy given form. Mother's been so forgetful lately, I heard Jason tell someone. We're looking into alternatives for her care. Forgetful. The man who couldn't remember I was lactose intolerant after 7 years of family dinners was painting me as senile. I thought of the chess games I still won against him, the crosswords I completed in ink while he struggled with the Monday puzzle. Forgetful. A younger woman, pregnant herself, sat beside me on the couch. This must be such a transition for you, she said kindly. From matriarch to grandmother. Stepping back must be difficult. I haven't stepped anywhere, I replied, my voice steady as granite. I'm standing exactly where I've always stood, in my own home. She blinked, confused by the steel in my tone, and quickly excused herself. The party continued around me, this celebration of new life built on the burial of my existence. I watched Claire laugh at something Jason whispered, watched her lean into him while avoiding my gaze, watched her play the role of happy wife while her childhood drawings gathered dust in a closet. The daughter I'd raised to speak truth now chose silence, and that silence screamed louder than any betrayal. As guests began leaving, offering congratulations and promises to visit the new nursery, I stood in my kitchen, still, my kitchen, despite the new appliances Jason had installed without asking, and surveyed the damage. Every photo album had been relocated to the basement. The furniture had been rearranged to erase the traffic patterns of 40 years. Even the smell had changed. Jason's cologne and Claire's new perfume overriding the lavender and coffee grounds that had always meant home. That went well, Jason announced, pouring himself scotch from Robert's decanter, another violation in a day full of them. Don't you think, Eleanor? I looked at him. This man who thought he could erase me with ultrasounds and contractor agreements, who believed silence could be purchased with baby showers and false concern. I think, I said slowly, each word deliberate, that you've shown your hand too early. His smile flickered. I don't know what you mean. No? I touched my pocket where my phone held his confession, his contracts, his envelope exchange, Then you have nothing to worry about. Claire started to speak, then stopped, her hand moving protectively to her stomach. That gesture, protective, maternal, struck me harder than all of Jason's schemes. She would guard her unborn child, but wouldn't protect her mother from the man trying to steal her home. After they left Jason's arm around Claire's shoulders like a shackle, I stood in my violated space and made my vow. They could remove my pictures, redistribute my furniture, plan their nurseries and modernizations, but I had evidence now. I had truth archived in digital clarity. And I had something Jason, for all his schemes, had forgotten to account for. The fury of a woman who'd spent a lifetime building this home and would not surrender it to anyone, least of all to a man who thought charm could conceal his corruption. Tomorrow, I would call Miriam. I would organize my evidence. I would begin the careful, methodical process of exposing Jason's fraud. But tonight, I sat in Robert's chair, still mine, always mine, and looked at the blank space where his portrait had hung. I won't let them win, I whispered to his absence. This house will remember us. Outside, the lake lapped against the shore with its ancient rhythm, unchanged by baby showers or forged documents. It had been here before Jason, before his schemes and Claire's silence. It would be here after. And so would I. The morning sun climbed slowly over the lake, as I told Miriam I needed to run errands in town. She looked up from her coffee, something knowing in her eyes, but she didn't question me. Perhaps she understood that some battles must be faced alone before they can be shared. I gathered my purse, the weight of it heavier with the documents I'd been collecting, bank statements, showing Jason's suspicious transfers, photographs of my belongings disappearing piece by piece, notes I'd kept hidden like weapons waiting for their moment. The drive to Attorney Tate's office took 15 minutes, but each mile stretched like an hour. I'd called ahead, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I need to know about my house, I'd said simply. I need to know what's truly mine. Mr. Tate's office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had stood on Main Street since before I was born. The stairs creaked under my feet, each sound echoing the doubts that had plagued me for months. Was I being paranoid? Was I destroying my family over suspicions? But then I remembered Claire's silence at dinner, when Jason suggested the nursing home, how she'd looked away when I'd asked if she agreed. That silence had spoken volumes. Miss Eleanor, Mr. Tate, greeted me, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many family disputes turn ugly. He was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 40, with careful eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Please, sit down. The leather chair creaked as I settled into it, and I found myself gripping my purse like an anchor. I need to know about the deed to my house, I said, surprised by the steel in my voice. My late husband left it to me, but lately, I've been made to feel. I paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like the ramblings of an old woman losing her grip. I've been made to feel like a guest in my own home. Mr. Tate leaned back, his chair groaning softly. Let me pull the records. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Your property at 47 Lakeshore Drive? Yes. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant hum of traffic and the clicking of keys. I studied the certificates on his wall, the neat rows of law books, anything to avoid confronting the possibility that Jason might have already found some way to claim what was mine. Here we are, Mr. Tate said, turning his monitor so I could see. The deed is in your name alone, Miss Eleanor, clear and uncontested. Your husband's will transferred full ownership to you upon his death 5 years ago. The relief that flooded through me was so intense I had to close my eyes. My hand trembled against the armrest. The weight of years of doubt crashed into a single breath. This is your house, he continued, and those 4 words became my armor, my shield, my sword. But then his expression shifted, professional caution replacing reassurance. However, I should warn you, if you're considering eviction proceedings, especially against family members, things can get complicated. Not legally, he added quickly, seeing my alarm. Legally, you're on solid ground. But emotionally, personally, eviction has a way of stripping away masks. People show their true faces when property is involved. I thought of Jason's charming smile, the way he'd convinced Claire that my memory was failing, that I was becoming a burden. Their masks are already slipping, I said quietly. Mr. Tate nodded slowly. Then my advice is this: gather everything, every piece of evidence you can find. Financial records, recordings, if legal in your state, witnesses to conversations. Build your case not just for the law, but for your own peace of mind. When you strike, if you strike, make it decisive. He pulled a leather folder from his desk drawer and slid it across to me. Copies of everything: the deed, your husband's will, property tax records, showing your sole payment history. Keep these safe. And Miss Eleanor? He leaned forward slightly. Don't let anyone make you doubt what's yours. Not your house, not your dignity, not your right to live as you choose. I took the folder, its weight both terrible and liberating. How long would eviction take? 30 days notice for family members residing without a lease, but I'd recommend attempting mediation first, if only to show the court you tried every avenue. He paused, studying my face. Though something tells me you've already tried talking. Talking, I repeated, thinking of Claire's empty reassurances, Jason's dismissive chuckles. Yes, I've tried talking. The walk back to my car felt different than the walk in. The sun had climbed higher, gilding the street in warm light, and I moved through it with new purpose. The folder under my arm wasn't just paper and ink. It was proof that my life, my home, my memories couldn't be erased by manipulation or silence. When I returned home, Miriam was still at the kitchen table, a second cup of coffee growing cold beside her. She looked up as I entered, taking in the set of my shoulders, the way I held myself straighter. Good errands? She asked carefully. I set my purse down, keeping the folder close. Everything I needed and more, I said, and for the first time in months, I meant it. The battle ahead would be brutal. I could feel it gathering like a storm over the lake, but now I knew the ground I stood on was mine, legally and morally. That night I stood on the lakeside porch where my husband and I had once watched countless sunsets, where Claire had taken her first steps, where Jason had once promised to take care of us both. The water lapped gently at the shore, indifferent to human betrayals and reconciliations alike. I thought about Mr. Tate's warning about masks falling away. Let them fall, I decided. Let Jason's ambitious cruelty be exposed. Let Claire's complicit silence be acknowledged. And let my own mask fall too, the mask of the accommodating mother, the gentle elder, the woman who could be slowly erased from her own life. Tomorrow, I would begin gathering evidence in earnest. Tonight, I held the folder against my chest and knew, with certainty that ran bone deep, that this house was mine. Not just legally, but in every memory soaked into its walls. Every morning I'd watch the sun rise over the water, every decision I'd made to keep it despite Jason's escalating suggestions to sell. This is your house, Mr. Tate had said, and those words echoed across the water, growing stronger with each repetition. This was my house, and I would fight for it with everything I had left. The walls would remember, the lake would witness, and no voice could erase me. The laughter from the living room carried through the walls like shards of glass, each burst reminding me that my home had become Jason's stage. I stood in the hallway, listening to him hold court with our neighbors, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, as he explained the improvements he'd made to what he called our property. The weight of the property deed in my pocket felt heavier than stone. Saturday evening had arrived with all the pomp Jason could muster. He'd invited half the neighborhood without asking, bottles of wine appearing from cases I'd never seen before, cheese platters arranged on my grandmother's serving boards. Through the archway, I could see him gesturing broadly, his expensive cologne wafting even to where I stood, that practiced smile never wavering as he played the gracious host in my house. This is my house, I said, stepping into the room. The conversation stuttered to a halt. Jason's hand froze mid-gesture, wine glass suspended like a question mark. The dozen guests turned toward me, their expressions shifting from social pleasure to uncertainty. Margaret Henderson from 2 doors down clutched her pearls, while Tom Bailey's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. Eleanor! Jason recovered first, his smile reassembling itself like broken china hastily glued. We were just discussing the new landscaping plans. There are no landscaping plans, I said, moving through the crowd with deliberate calm. My fingers found Claire's childhood drawing on the mantel, a crayon rendering of our house by the lake, Mommy's happy place scrawled in uneven letters across the top. I turned it to face the room. This house doesn't need improving. It never has. Claire stood near the kitchen doorway, her wine glass trembling slightly. Her eyes met mine for a fraction of a second before dropping to study the hardwood floor, the same floors where she'd taken her first steps, now polished to Jason's exacting standards. Mother-in-law, Jason's voice, carried that particular edge of condescension, wrapped in false warmth. Perhaps we should discuss family matters privately. There's nothing private about what you've been doing, I replied, feeling the steel in my spine that 30 years of teaching had forged. Telling our neighbors about your plans for my property. Acting as if you own what was never yours. The room seemed to inhale collectively. Sarah Chen, who ran the book club I'd founded, shifted uncomfortably. We thought, Jason said you were planning to move to that lovely retirement community by the marina. Did he? I turned to face Jason fully, watching the mask slip for just a moment. And did he mention that this house, every board, nail, and memory in it belongs to me? That the deed has only one name on it? Eleanor, you're being dramatic. Jason set down his wine glass with studied casualness, but I caught the micro-tremor in his fingers. We're family. What's yours is. Mine, I interrupted. What's mine is mine, Jason, and it will stay that way. The guests began the delicate dance of social extraction, murmuring about the time, early mornings, forgotten commitments. Jason's jaw worked silently, his carefully constructed evening crumbling like wet sand. But it was Claire's silence that cut deepest. She stood frozen, neither defending her husband nor supporting her mother, trapped in a purgatory of her own making. Perhaps we should check on the appetizers, Jason said, his hand finding my elbow with pressure just shy of painful, in the kitchen. I allowed him to guide me away from the dissipating crowd, but only because I had more to say without an audience. The kitchen still smelled of the rosemary bread I'd baked that morning, a detail that seemed to belong to another lifetime. My leather-bound journal lay on the counter where I'd deliberately left it, pages marked with tabs labeled evidence, though Jason didn't notice it yet. You're embarrassing yourself, he hissed once we were alone, dropping all pretense of charm. And Claire embarrassed herself the moment she chose silence, I said, pulling free from his grip. But you've been planning this for months, haven't you? The suggestions about my confusion, the changes to my home, the gradual erasure of my presence. You're paranoid, but his eyes flickered toward the door, calculating whether the guests could hear. This is exactly why Claire and I think you need— Stop. The word came out sharp enough to cut. Stop speaking for my daughter. Stop pretending you care about my well-being. And stop acting like this house will ever be yours. It will be mine eventually. Her spine stiffened. Each word dropped like lead. He said, the words slipping out like oil from a cracked engine. His face immediately shifted, recognizing the error. There it is. A stillness took hold. The room hung on the edge of that truth. I said quietly. The truth. Finally. Not ours, yours. That's what this has always been about. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, the last guest leaving. In the sudden quiet, I could hear Claire's soft crying from the living room, muffled but unmistakable. Jason's face cycled through emotions, rage, calculation, forced calm before settling on his default mask of condescension. The family dinner next week, he said, straightening his collar. We'll discuss this properly. With documentation. With lawyers if necessary. Yes, I agreed, thinking of the evidence I'd gathered, the witnesses I'd already contacted. We certainly will. And Jason? I picked up my journal, letting him see the labeled tabs for the first time. I've been a teacher for 30 years. I know how to do my homework. His laughter came out brittle, like ice cracking under pressure. You have no idea what you're starting, Eleanor. I'm not starting anything, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. I'm finishing it. He left the kitchen with measured steps, calling to Claire in a voice that mimicked concern. I heard their muted conversation, her tears, his reassurances that sounded more like commands. The front door opened and closed again, Claire choosing to leave with him, as she always did. I stood alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of Jason's failed performance. The wine glasses would need washing, the cheese plates clearing, the house would need to be reclaimed one detail at a time. But first, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Miriam's number. The dinner next week would be different. This time, I wouldn't be fighting alone. Through the window, I watched Jason's car pull away, Claire's silhouette barely visible in the passenger seat. The lake beyond remained calm, unchanged by human drama, reflecting the last light of evening like a promise. This house had weathered worse storms. It would weather this one too. But the crack in Jason's facade had finally shown itself, and I intended to split it wide open. The documentation was ready, the witnesses alerted, and most importantly, I'd found my voice again. The same voice that had commanded classrooms, raised a daughter, and built a life worth fighting for. The family dinner loomed ahead like a storm front, but I was no longer afraid of the weather. Let Jason bring his lawyers, his manipulations, his carefully practiced lies. I had something more powerful, the truth, and the determination to speak it. As I began collecting the abandoned wine glasses, I noticed Claire had left her sweater draped over the chair, the one I'd knitted for her last Christmas. I folded it carefully, breathing in the lingering scent of her perfume mixed with something sharper, guilt, perhaps, or shame. She would have to choose soon, and that choice would define us both. The house settled into evening quiet, but it no longer felt like defeat. It felt like preparation, like the deep breath before the plunge, like the moment before truth breaks free from all the lies that tried to bury it. And in that silence, the house breathed with her. 2 days had passed since the gathering, and the weight of what needed to be done pressed against my chest like a stone. I stood in my bedroom, fingers trembling slightly as I turned the key in the desk drawer's lock. The deed lay there, crisp and absolute, alongside the eviction notice I'd had my lawyer prepare. Beneath them, photocopies of Jason's forged contracts as evidence of his attempted theft. Each fraudulent signature a knife in my back. The house felt different tonight, charged with the electricity of coming storm. Through the dining room window, I could see Jason's BMW in the driveway, that expensive cologne of his already announcing his presence before he'd even entered. Claire was in the kitchen, her movements hesitant, brittle, as if she sensed the shift in the air. Her silence these past weeks had carved hollows in me deeper than Jason's schemes ever could. "Mom?" Claire's voice floated from the doorway. "Dinner's ready." I tucked the documents into a manila envelope, feeling the weight of paper that held more power than any weapon. "I'll be right there." The dining room tableau was almost peaceful, Jason at the head of my table, when he claimed that spot. Claire beside him, her hand resting protectively over her swelling belly. The child she carried, the grandchild I should have been celebrating, had become another tool in this war I never wanted to fight. I set the envelope beside my plate, my movements deliberate, controlled. Jason's eyes tracked it, a flicker of unease crossing his carefully composed features. "Before we eat," I said, my voice steady as steel, "there's something we need to discuss." "Eleanor," Jason began, that practiced charm sliding into place, "if this is about the improvements to the house." "This is about the house, yes." I pulled out the deed, unfolding it with careful precision. "This is the deed to this house. It's in my name alone." The paper trembled slightly in my hands, not from fear, but from the force of keeping my rage contained. I laid it flat on the table between us, my father's signature visible alongside mine, the date from 30 years ago when this became my sanctuary, my identity, my fortress. Claire's fork clattered against her plate. "Mom, what are you?" "I'm establishing facts, Claire." The words came out sharper than intended, and I saw her flinch. "Good. Let her feel something, anything, through that wall of silence she'd built." Jason leaned forward, his businessman's mask firmly in place. "Mother-in-law, I don't understand the hostility. We're family." "Family." The word tasted bitter. Family doesn't forge forged contracts. Family doesn't attempt to steal what isn't theirs. I pulled out the photocopies, spreading them across the table like evidence at a trial. Jason's color drained, his confident facade cracking. These are copies of the fraudulent documents you created, Jason. My signature forged, dates manipulated, all part of your scheme to transfer ownership of my home. That's ridiculous, he stammered, but his hand reached reflexively for the papers before pulling back. Is it? I kept my voice calm, though inside, decades of teaching had prepared me for this moment, maintaining authority, while everything inside screamed. My lawyer thinks otherwise. So will the police when I file the report tomorrow. Claire's sharp intake of breath cut through the room. Mom, you can't. Jason would never. Wouldn't he? I turned to my daughter, and for the first time in weeks, I let her see the full weight of my disappointment. You knew, Claire. You knew what he was planning, and you said nothing. Her silence now was different, heavy with guilt rather than complicity. Her hand moved to her belly again, that unconscious gesture of protection, and something cold crystallized in my chest. There's more, I said, pulling out the final document. This is your formal eviction notice. You have 30 days to leave. The eviction notice landed between them with the weight of a gavel. Jason's jaw clenched, his mask finally, completely falling away to reveal the calculating predator beneath. You can't do this, he said, voice low and dangerous. Claire is pregnant. That's your grandchild. Is it? The question slipped out, soft as silk but sharp as a blade. The room froze. Claire's face went white, her hand trembling over her stomach. Jason's expression shifted from shock to rage, to something else, uncertainty? Fear? What are you implying? His voice had lost its smooth edge. I stood, gathering my documents with deliberate care. I'm not implying anything, Jason. I'm simply observing that a man who would forge documents, who would manipulate his wife into betraying her mother, who would attempt to steal a widow's home, such a man might be capable of other deceptions. The seed of doubt was planted, the doubt taking root in the space between them. I could see it in the way Claire's eyes darted to Jason, in the way his hand reached for hers but stopped short. The locks will be changed tomorrow, I continued, my voice returning to that classroom authority I'd perfected over 40 years. Any attempt to enter without my permission will be considered trespassing. My lawyer has been instructed to proceed with both the eviction and the fraud charges if you don't comply. I moved toward the door, then paused, not turning back. The child, whoever's it is welcome here always. But you, Jason, are not. And Claire, I let her name hang in the air, weighted with all the love and disappointment a mother could carry. You'll need to decide what matters more, his lies or my truth. The dining room behind me was silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock, my father's grandfather clock, in my house, marking the 30 days until I would reclaim what was mine. In my room, I locked the desk drawer again, the documents safe inside. Through the window, I could hear raised voices, Jason's defensive anger, Claire's tearful questions. The truth I'd planted would grow now, watered by their own doubts and secrets. I marked the calendar on my desk, circling the date 30 days hence. The eviction deadline wasn't just a legal requirement, it was a promise to myself. No more would I be erased in my own home. No more would my belongings disappear, replaced by Jason's preferences. No more would I pretend that Claire's silence hadn't cut me as deeply as any betrayal could. The lakeside house stood firm around me, its walls holding decades of memory, teaching awards on the mantle Jason had tried to pack away, photographs of Claire's childhood he'd relegated to storage, my mother's china he'd called outdated. Every piece was a part of me he'd tried to eliminate, not understanding that you cannot erase a woman who has spent a lifetime building herself. Tomorrow, the locks would change. Tomorrow, the police report would be filed. Tomorrow, the world would know that Eleanor Morrison was not a woman to be swept aside, pension check by pension check, into some nursing home while vultures picked over her bones. But tonight, I sat by my window, watching the lake reflect the moon's cold light, and allowed myself one moment of grief. Not for Jason, he was exactly what I'd suspected, but for Claire, my daughter, who had chosen silence over truth, who had let her husband's ambition eclipse her mother's dignity. The house would be mine again, justice would be served. But the crack in my relationship with Claire that would take more than legal documents to heal. Still, I had planted the seed of doubt about the child's paternity, not from cruelty, but from a desperate need to shake her awake, to make her question everything about the man she'd chosen over me. 30 days. The grandfather clock downstairs chimed the hour, and I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of what was to come. Eleanor Morrison, retired teacher, mother, survivor. I would reclaim every part of that identity, even if it meant standing alone in my victory. The message arrived at dusk, just as the lake began swallowing the last copper threads of sunlight. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, where I'd been arranging fresh-cut roses from the garden, the same roses my mother had planted 30 years ago, their roots as deep as memory itself. The sender was anonymous, but the attached photos needed no introduction. There was Jason, my son-in-law, in his downtown office, bent over documents that bore my signature, except I'd never signed them. The forgeries were crude when you knew where to look, but sophisticated enough to fool anyone who trusted him, which, until that moment, included me. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. Instead, a cold clarity settled over me like morning frost, sharp and absolute. The photos showed more than fraud. They revealed conversations, text messages between Jason and his business partner about the old woman's property, and how they'd finally be able to develop it properly once she's out of the picture. But it was the last image that cut deepest, a screenshot of messages between Jason and Claire, my daughter. She knew. She'd known for weeks. "Mom?" Claire's voice drifted from the dining room where she was setting the table for dinner. "We were expecting guests, Miriam, my oldest friend, and a few neighbors." Jason would arrive soon from his office, carrying that expensive cologne that never quite masked the smell of his ambition. I slipped the phone into my pocket, my fingers finding the smooth surface like a weapon I wasn't yet ready to draw. "Coming, dear," I called back, my voice steady as the lake on a windless day. But inside, something fundamental had shifted, like tectonic plates grinding against each other before an earthquake. The dining room glowed with candlelight, the good china gleaming like promises waiting to be broken. Claire had used my mother's tablecloth, the one with hand-embroidered edges that had witnessed every family celebration and crisis for 3 generations. She looked up as I entered, and for a moment, I saw her as she'd been at 7, proudly showing me a drawing of our house she'd made in school. "This is our forever home," she'd written in crayon beneath it. I still had that drawing tucked away in my desk, along with every report card, every Mother's Day card, every artifact of a love I'd thought unshakable. "You look pale," Claire said, but her eyes slid away from mine too quickly. Yes, she knew. The knowledge sat between us like a third presence at the table. "Just tired," I said, though exhaustion was the farthest thing from what I felt. What I felt was the peculiar weightlessness that comes before a fall, when gravity hasn't quite claimed you yet, but you know it's coming. Jason arrived 15 minutes later, all false warmth and practiced charm. He kissed my cheek, Judas, with better aftershave, and helped himself to wine from the sideboard. "Eleanor, you're looking lovely tonight," he said, the lie rolling off his tongue as easily as water off stone. "Jason," I said, tasting his name like something bitter I needed to spit out, "we need to talk." "After dinner, surely." He gestured toward the door where we could already hear Miriam's voice in the foyer. "We have guests." "No," I said, pulling out my phone. "Now." Claire's intake of breath was sharp enough to cut. She knew what was coming, had probably been dreading this moment, even as she'd participated in its creation through her silence. I turned the phone toward them, swiping through the photos, slowly, deliberately, watching Jason's face transform from confusion to recognition to something almost like relief, as if he was glad the performance could finally end. The silence felt like a physical weight, pressing against the walls. "I can explain," he began, but I raised my hand. "No need. It's exactly what it looks like." My voice had turned to steel, forged in the fire of betrayal, fraud, forgery, conspiracy to steal my home. Mom, Claire started, but the word died in her throat when I turned to her. "You knew." "Not a question." A statement of fact, cold and final as a headstone. You knew and you said nothing. The silence that followed had weight, had texture. It pressed against the walls of my mother's house, my house like floodwater testing for weak points. Through it, we could hear Miriam laughing with the neighbors in the foyer, unaware that inside this room, a family was collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. The silence felt like a physical weight, pressing against the walls. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Claire whispered, her hands twisting the napkin in her lap, the same nervous gesture she'd had since childhood when caught in a lie. How was it supposed to happen, I asked. Was I supposed to sign the papers without reading them? Was I supposed to die conveniently before discovering the truth? Or was I supposed to be shuffled off to that nursing home Jason keeps mentioning, too senile to fight back? Jason stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You don't understand the opportunity here. This property could be worth millions if developed properly. You're sitting on a gold mine, living like it's still 1960. It's my home, I said simply. Not an opportunity. Not an investment. My home. Our home, Claire said suddenly, desperately. It's our home too, Mom. I grew up here. Doesn't that mean anything? The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw, not the little girl who'd drawn pictures of our forever home, but a stranger who'd chosen her husband's greed over her mother's dignity. It meant everything, I said quietly. Until you decided it meant nothing. The guest chose that moment to enter, Miriam's cheerful voice dying as she registered the tableau, Jason standing rigid by his chair, Claire crying silently, and me holding my phone like evidence in a court of law. Which, I supposed, it was. Perhaps we should, Miriam began, but I shook my head. No, please stay. You should all know what's been happening under this roof. I turned to address the small gathering of friends and neighbors who'd frozen in the doorway. Jason has been attempting to steal my home through forged documents, and Claire knew about it. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, ripples of shock spreading outward. Jason's carefully constructed facade cracked, then shattered entirely. You bitter old woman, he snarled, all pretense of charm evaporating. You have no proof that will hold up in court. Actually, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded, I do. You see, Jason, when you forge someone's signature, you should probably check if they're left-handed. All those documents you had me sign? The signature slants the wrong way. It was such a small thing, but it was enough. I saw the moment he realized his mistake, saw the confidence drain from his face like color from a dying sunset. We're leaving, he announced, grabbing Claire's arm. But Claire didn't move. She sat there, frozen between two worlds, two loyalties, two versions of herself. In that moment, I saw her make her choice not in what she said, but in what she didn't say. Her silence was its own form of violence, cutting deeper than any words could have. The silence felt like a physical weight, pressing against the walls. Your silence, I told her, my voice breaking for the first time, wounds more than his lies. The silence felt like a physical weight, pressing against the walls. Jason stormed out, his departure punctuated by the slam of the front door. Claire remained for another heartbeat, 2, 3 long enough for me to hope, before she rose and followed him, leaving only the ghost of her perfume and the echo of everything left unsaid. The room exhaled collectively once they were gone. Miriam moved to my side, her hand finding mine, warm and steady and real. The other guests murmured sympathies, outrage, offers of help, but their voices seemed to come from very far away, as if I was underwater, looking up at the surface world through layers of lake water. Later, after everyone had gone, I stood on the lakeside porch where I'd stood countless times before, but never quite like this. The lake was mirror black, reflecting a crescent moon that looked sharp enough to draw blood. I thought about the morning Jason had first suggested the nursing home, how it had seemed like such a small betrayal then, manageable, survivable. I hadn't recognized it as the first loosened stone in an avalanche. Inside, the dining room table still bore the remnants of the dinner that never was plates, that would never hold food, glasses that would never toast to family, conversations that would never heal what had been broken. I gathered Claire's childhood drawings from my desk, spreading them across the table, like evidence of a love that had existed once, solid and true, as the foundation of this house. In every drawing, she'd included all of us together, standing in front of this home, holding hands. When had she stopped seeing us that way? When had home become just property, and mother become just obstacle? The legal papers were easier to face than those drawings. I photographed every forged document, every fraudulent claim, building my case with the methodical precision I'd once used to grade papers, to plan lessons, to build a life I'd thought was secure. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 40 years teaching others to read carefully, to think critically, to question what seemed too good to be true. Yet I'd failed to apply those lessons to my own family. Claire didn't call that night, or the next. Her silence stretched between us like the lake itself, vast and deep and treacherous. I knew she was still with Jason. Miriam had seen them at the grocery store. Claire's eyes red-rimmed, but her wedding ring still firmly in place. That ring I'd helped them choose, sitting in the jewelry store and believing in their future even more than they did. The silence felt like a physical weight, pressing against the walls. But silence, I was learning, could be its own form of action. My silence had enabled Jason's plans to grow in shadow. Claire's silence had watered them with complicity. Now, in the aftermath, our silence was building walls higher than any words could climb. The silence felt like a physical weight, pressing against the walls. Yet in that silence, something else was taking root. Not forgiveness that would come later, if at all, but determination. This house would not be stolen. This life would not be erased. The women's shelter Miriam had mentioned months ago, the one desperately seeking a safe house for women starting over, perhaps that's what this place was meant to become. Not a monument to betrayal, but a sanctuary for those who'd been betrayed. The silence felt like a physical weight pressing against the walls. I stood again on the porch, feeling the wooden boards solid beneath my feet, boards my father had laid, that had held the weight of generations of footsteps, of stories, of love both given and withheld. The lake whispered against the shore, the same conversation it had been having with this land since before any of us thought to claim it. Tomorrow, I would call my lawyer. Tomorrow, I would begin the legal battle to protect what was mine. Tomorrow, I would start transforming this house from a crime scene into something else, something better. But tonight, I simply stood witness to my own survival, to the dignity that betrayal couldn't steal, to the strength that silence couldn't erode. The silence felt like a physical weight, pressing against the walls. The moon had risen higher, its reflection stretching across the water like a silver path. Some cultures believed that was the route souls took to the afterlife, but I wasn't ready for that journey yet. I had work to do, a house to protect, a new purpose to build from the rubble of the old. Claire's drawings were still spread across the dining room table, but now I saw them differently, not as evidence of loss, but as blueprints for what this house had been at its best. A shelter, a sanctuary, a place where love could take root and grow despite the harsh seasons. A loon called across the water, its haunting cry echoing off the opposite shore. Another answered from somewhere in the darkness. Even in isolation, we find ways to connect, to call out across the vast spaces that divide us. Perhaps Claire would find her voice again someday. Perhaps she wouldn't. Either way, I would continue to stand on this porch, in this house, on this ground that no one could steal from me without stealing my very self. The revelation had come. The departure had followed. Now came the harder part. The rebuilding, the reimagining, the slow transformation of a wound into a doorway through which others might find their own salvation. The house stood ready, as it always had, to shelter whatever came next. The house echoed differently now, not with the hollow ring of betrayal that had followed Jason's departure, but with something quieter, a resonant silence that begged to be filled with purpose rather than grief. I stood in what had been the nursery, my fingers tracing the mint-green walls Jason had chosen without asking, without caring that the color made me think of hospital corridors rather than new life. The crib stood in the corner like a monument to promises never kept, to a future that had been nothing more than another of his elaborate deceptions. "This ends. Today," I whispered to the empty room, my voice carrying that steel I'd discovered during our confrontation 3 weeks ago. The firmness surprised me still, how it had grown from somewhere deep, transforming my teacher's patience into something harder, more protective. I wasn't just reclaiming space, I was rewriting the story of this house, one brushstroke at a time. The paint can opened with a satisfying pop, warm ivory the color of sunrise over the lake, of possibility without pretense. As I rolled the first stroke over Jason's mint walls, something loosened in my chest. Each pass of the roller was an erasure, a declaration. You don't get to mark my walls anymore. You don't get to claim my spaces. Claire's absence hung in the air like morning mist over the water. She'd chosen me over Jason in the end, yes, but her silence, that choking hesitation that had let him advance his schemes while she watched, still carved hollow spaces between my ribs. I'd raised her to be brave, to speak truth, even when it trembled on her lips. Where had I gone wrong? Or was it that Jason's charm had been a poison too sweet to recognize until it had already numbed her voice? The crib came apart easier than I'd expected. Each screw I removed felt like releasing a ghost. The mobile with its dancing elephants, Claire had picked it out, her eyes bright with the grandmother's joy I'd never experienced, now went into a box marked for donation. Someone else's grandchild would watch those elephants dance. Someone whose family hadn't fractured along lines of greed and silence. But you're not broken, I reminded myself, hefting the crib rails. Scared, Massachusetts YBE, changed, certainly, but not broken. The physical work felt good, necessary. My retired teacher's hands, more accustomed to grading papers than manual labor, grew sure with purpose. By afternoon, the room had transformed. The ivory walls caught the light differently, warmer, more inviting. I brought in the quilt my mother had made, interlocking rings in blues and golds, a pattern called wedding ring, though it would shelter no marriage here. Instead, it would warm someone who needed sanctuary. I placed fresh daisies on the nightstand, their faces turned toward the window that overlooked the lake. Simple flowers, honest flowers, nothing exotic or demanding, just beauty that asked for nothing in return. The property deed, that document Jason had tried to forge, to steal, to corrupt, I filed in the desk drawer in plain sight. No more hiding, no more pretending threats didn't exist, but also no more fear. The room was ready before I knew who it was for. Miriam called that evening. "There's someone who needs help," she said, her voice careful, testing my readiness. "Her name is Naomi. She's running from something similar to what you faced. Except she lost." "Lost?" Her son-in-law took everything while her daughter stood by. But unlike Claire, her daughter chose him completely. Naomi's been staying at the shelter, but she needs dignity, I finished. She needs a place where she can remember. She's worth more than what was taken from her. "Eleanor, you don't have to. Send her tomorrow. The room's ready." That night, I walked the lakeside porch, feeling the familiar creaks beneath my feet. This deck where I'd served Jason coffee while he plotted against me, where Claire had sat in silence, as her husband dismantled my life piece by piece. It could have been poisoned ground. But water has a way of washing things clean, and the lake's constant presence reminded me that some things endure despite the storms that try to break them. Naomi arrived the next morning with one suitcase and eyes that couldn't quite meet mine. She was perhaps 60, her gray hair pulled back severely, her clothes clean but worn in that way that speaks of too many nights in temporary places. Her hands shook slightly as she set down her bag. She began, then stopped. "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Accept kindness without paying for it. He always said kindness had a price, that everything did." I recognized the programming, the way betrayal rewrites your understanding of human connection. "There's no price here," I said, leading her to the room that had been meant for a grandchild who would never exist. "You don't have to apologize for existing here." She stood in the doorway, taking in the warm walls, the quilt, the daisies facing the lake. Something crumbled in her expression, not collapse, but release, like ice breaking up in spring. "How long?" she asked. "As long as you need to remember who you were before he tried to erase you." That first night, I heard her crying through the walls, not the bitter sobs of fresh betrayal but something deeper, older, the grief of someone finally safe enough to feel the full weight of what they'd survived. I made tea and left it outside her door with a note. "The lake is beautiful at sunrise. The porch is yours whenever you're ready." She emerged 3 days later, tentative as a deer testing winter ice. We sat together on the porch, watching the water catch morning light. "My daughter knew," she said suddenly. "For 2 years, she knew what he was doing. Moving money, hiding assets, preparing to leave me with nothing. She knew, and she helped him." The silence cuts deepest, I agreed, thinking of Claire's face at that dinner table, how she'd known about the forged documents and said nothing. It's not the betrayal itself, but the choice to let it happen that leaves the real scar. Does it heal? I considered lying, offering comfort instead of truth. But Naomi deserved better than pretty deceptions. It changes. The wound becomes something else, not healed exactly, but integrated. You learn to carry it without letting it carry you. She stayed 6 weeks. In that time, the house began to shift, to breathe differently. Her presence didn't fill the space Claire had left, but created something new alongside it. She cooked elaborate breakfasts, saying she needed to remember she was worth the effort. She painted watercolors of the lake, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. She even laughed one afternoon, really laughed when a duck stole her sandwich right off the porch railing. The day before she left, she handed me a note. Her handwriting was careful, deliberate. "You gave me back my air." I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without asking permission. She'd found a job in another state, a fresh start where no one knew her story unless she chose to tell it. As her taxi pulled away, I felt not emptiness but expansion, the sense that my house had discovered its new purpose. 2 weeks later, Miriam called again. Her name is Ruth. She's younger, barely 30. Her situation is complicated. Ruth arrived in the evening, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical distance. She'd driven herself, her car packed with whatever she'd managed to salvage from a marriage that had turned dangerous in ways more immediate than Jason's financial violence. There were no visible bruises, but I recognized the way she held herself, careful, contained, as if taking up less space might make her less of a target. "I don't want to talk about it yet," she said immediately. "Is that okay? The room is yours. The story is yours to tell, or keep." She nodded, relief flickering across her face. Unlike Naomi's careful politeness, Ruth moved through the house like someone relearning how to exist without surveillance. She spent hours at the lake's edge, sometimes swimming with fierce strokes that looked like she was fighting the water itself, other times sitting so still, the herons accepted her as part of the landscape. On her 5th night, she cooked dinner for us both, nothing elaborate, just pasta with fresh tomatoes from the garden I'd finally reclaimed from Jason's improvements. As we ate, she said quietly, "He used to time my showers, said water was expensive, but really he just needed to know exactly where I was every minute." "Control disguised as concern," I said. "They're good at that." "Your son-in-law?" "He preferred financial control. Slower violence, but violence nonetheless." Ruth stayed 2 months. During that time, Claire finally called. Her voice was thin, uncertain. "Mom? I heard what you're doing. With the house." "What I'm doing?" "Helping women, giving them space to heal." The word heal caught in her throat like she was asking permission to apply it to herself. Part of me wanted to offer absolution, to tell her that her silence hadn't carved permanent damage between us, but I'd learned that sometimes the kindest thing is to let people sit with the weight of their choices. "The house has room for those who need it," I said simply. "Do I? Would I qualify?" "You chose me over him in the end. That has to count for something." "But Claire," I paused, choosing my words like selecting stones to build a bridge. "You'll have to earn back more than just forgiveness. You'll have to earn back your own voice." Ruth was swimming when Claire visited. They passed each other on the porch, my daughter who'd been silent, the stranger who was learning to speak again. Something passed between them, A recognition maybe, or just the acknowledgement of parallel griefs. That evening, Ruth said, "Your daughter carries it differently than you do." Carries what? The weight of what happened. You've transformed it into purpose. She's still drowning in it. I thought of Claire's haunted eyes, the way she'd looked at the transformed nursery like it was both accusation and invitation. She's young still. She has time to learn that silence isn't safety, just another kind of cage. Ruth left 3 days later, stronger, steadier. She'd secured a restraining order, started divorce proceedings, found a job that would let her rebuild far from the man who'd tried to erase her. As she loaded her car, she turned back to the house, taking it in like she was memorizing something precious. "This place," she said. "It's not about the walls, is it? It's about the permission to exist without apology." "That's all any of us really need," I agreed. "Space to remember we're whole, even with our cracks." After she drove away, I stood in what had been the nursery, now transformed into something far more powerful than a grandmother's dream deferred. The afternoon light through the windows painted the ivory walls gold, and I could feel them all, the women who would come after Naomi and Ruth, seeking sanctuary not from mere physical danger, but from the deeper violence of being erased by those who claimed to love them. The house that Jason had tried to steal had become something he could never have imagined, a place where betrayal transformed into strength, where silence broke into speech, where women remembered they were worth more than the sum of what had been taken from them. I walked out onto the lakeside porch, that threshold between water and land, between what was and what could be. The lake stretched endless, patient, reflecting the sky's changing moods without judgment. Like this house, like me. We'd survived the storm, and now we offered shelter to others still finding their way to shore. The property deed sat in its drawer, legal and binding, but the true ownership of this place had shifted to something beyond paperwork. This house belonged now to every woman who would find her voice within these walls, who would paint over someone else's choices with her own colors, who would learn that kindness without price wasn't fantasy but foundation. As the sun set over the water, I thought I heard it, not literal sound, but something deeper. The echo of future voices, future laughter, future tears that would water new growth. My lakeside house had become what I'd never known it needed to be. A sanctuary where betrayal became the soil for something stronger, where silence learned to sing.